the worst way to ruin somebody's career is to go from somebody who is absolutely phenomenal at selling and then turning them into a bookkeeper.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but that's what we do all the time is we say, okay, you need to move into this next role. And what we're finding is that both on the leasing side, also on the maintenance tech side, we're seeing this progression that grows within the leasing role. So you have a leasing 1, leasing 2, leasing 3, and you grow within that.
Welcome to the How to Scale Commercial Real Estate Show. Whether you are an active or passive investor, we'll teach you how to scale your real estate investing business into something big.
Brent Williams is the chief insider of the largest online professional network for multifamily professionals. Brent, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam. Glad to be here.
Hey, man, the pleasure's mine. There are 3 questions I ask every guest who comes on the show in 90 seconds or less. Can you tell me, where did you start? Where are you now? And how did you get there?
Yeah, 90 seconds can be hard. But yeah, I started in multifamily because I actually jumped into multifamily, which is a little different than most people. They usually stumble into it somehow. But for me, I jumped into it. I was a big proponent of resident retention, how to get people to be connected with their communities. So I went with a social network for apartment communities when I first jumped in, and that failed miserably. And we realized that we were a little too early to the game as far as MySpace was the big thing. So we decided to step back and show the industry what social networking was, and then how to apply it to their communities. So we launched a social network for the multifamily industry, and so that they could share best practices, trends, and that sort of thing. And so then we're going to actually circle back around and say, okay, now let's apply that to your communities. But once we launched, it was amazing. We got such a huge turnout that we said, you know what, this is where we need to be. So we've been facilitating conversations in multifamily ever since.
So if you can, and maybe I missed this, or maybe I'm just slow, probably both, can you tell me in one sentence what it is that you guys do today?
Yeah, so we have a social network for multifamily. It's called multifamilyinsiders.com. It's a lot like, LinkedIn, but for multifamily.
Very, very
and so
cool.
Yeah, we do the same types of things. If you want to share memes, they can do that. If you want to talk about in-depth discussions about how to run properties, how to acquire properties, we handle that as well. It's all about people sharing knowledge with each other.
That's really cool. I love that. And so just to get your story clear in my own mind, you had a resident retention program that you were running, and yet you said you were early to the game.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of inspired the idea of, hey, instead of maybe running resident retention, we should run a networking site for people that are looking to acquire and own multifamily properties.
Right. So in general, we always hear the story about, if we can retain this resident, we're going to save $4,000 or something like that on that turnover cost.
Sure.
And so if we can, there's a big financial aspect to that. And so I lived in a lot of apartment communities in the past, and I kept hopping from concession to concession. And I think a lot of people do that because we don't fundamentally have any ties to that property.
Right.
So if my thought was, well, shoot, if we can establish those ties, if I knew just one person in a fairly deep way, I'd be much more likely to stay. And so I technically actually started another company before that, which was kind of a event planning company for multifamily. And that was a lot of fun. We threw a lot of events, but it wasn't scalable. And so like I said, as MySpace was the big dog and it was social networking was becoming a thing, I thought, well, why don't we apply this concept to apartment communities? But the problem was that I didn't realize that, and this may still be true to some degree, but especially back then, property managers didn't want the residents actually talking to each other. They have summer parties and that sort of thing, but if they're not there, like chaperoning, they're terrified of this idea of, talking about, the increase in rents or talking about the car that got broken into. Those types of things, they don't want those conversations happening necessarily. So they didn't really want to have this open social network where the residents could actually discuss. So now that's changed over the years because I think that those conversations are happening regardless. And so it's better to kind of be in charge of that. But back then it was terrifying. So we had to help educate the industry on what social networking was. And that was a pretty big task in itself.
Man, that's cool. Tell me, I guess, when it comes to what you guys are doing today, an idea is one thing. Getting it launched and scaling it is an entirely different thing. How did you guys do it?
A lot of TLC. When you launch a social network, you have to make sure that every single person's question is answered. They need to feel like they're heard. So I spent so much time at the beginning of taking individual questions, sharing them with somebody I knew that might have an answer, and saying, "Will you please take a moment and answer this question?" So it was a lot of that in the beginning. But even then, people really, at the time there was nothing like it. And so if you wanted to network and connect, you had to go to the apartment association, which is fine. And I'm a huge proponent of being a part of a local apartment association. But people still want to do that kind of self-serve, knowledge sharing. And so it was easy that for them on a daily basis to jump on a site and share their ideas and interact in that way, and not necessarily have to wait for the next event to connect with somebody else.
Absolutely. And I think it's unique to have it focused. I mean, there's lots of, there's lots of groups and things like that. I think you can join around really any industry, but for you to have it specifically, focused around the multifamily industry, how to get involved, how to get started, all those things is really, really cool. What are some common, I guess, pain points that you feel like people come to you with? Either they're new or they're learning to scale or learning to grow their portfolio, and they say, "Man, Brent, is this something that I can learn from and really sharpen my skills on with your group?"
So I think the biggest, I don't know if it's a pain point as much as where the industry is trending. I think that, and this will apply both from the on-site person all the way to the owner and how they're positioning their properties, is this question of centralization. And so historically with multifamily, you have, a lot of the functions done on-site. You have your bookkeeping, you have your collections, you have all of these vendor interactions, and some of them need to stay on-site, but we're seeing more of a trend of taking these functions or these people, it could be a mix of both, and taking them off-site to a centralized location, or centralizing the tasks if they happen to be remote. So, there doesn't necessarily need to be somebody on-site doing collections. They could take that function off fairly easily. So what it does is it changes the roles of people who work in the industry, where you become either much more specialized in sales on getting new leases, or you become much more specialized in the resident experience. And then then from a structural perspective, you have a whole new, necessarily office maybe, of people who are working in a centralized way to support a whole portfolio of properties.
Yeah, that is a really interesting shift. Certainly we've seen across a variety of industries, but this one as well, where a lot of those, I'm not going to call them lower level tasks, but they're tasks that can be batched across multiple assets. Like, oh, okay, well, you don't have to be on site, like you said, doing collections and things like that. That's a really cool problem that people solve. Do you guys handle, like, let's say I came to you and I said, "Brent, man, I don't know anything about multifamily and I want to learn. Where do I start?"
So I think there's a couple different things. It really depends on, what type of view you're looking for. So we have a Facebook group called Multifamily Share Space. And I think that even if, whether it's somebody coming into the industry or somebody who's been in the industry a long time and they want to get a pulse on what their teams are thinking, that they may not be hearing, going to a place like that, you could hear just unfiltered comments about their pain points with their job or with the industry. It is eye-opening to see what struggles that they're facing. And I think, frankly, every person, and I know your audience is probably more higher level, so they should be on there looking and seeing what their teams are probably thinking about, but may not be passing along to upper management, to saying, "Here, I'm struggling with, the residents are so much more difficult these days, or the challenge we're facing with, especially when we went through COVID, it was incredibly difficult. We have so many more tasks and functions for the on-site team. Now, granted, some of that's going to be changing with centralization, but as of right now, they are asked to juggle so many things. So getting that deep view from what people are talking about and complaining about, or it's not all complaining, it's sometimes it's really positive too. That's really eye-opening for a lot of people.
Well, on that note, what are some things, I guess, as you look at these forums and you have access to those, what are some things that you feel like people are some consistent themes maybe that you're hearing right now that are some risks and or some opportunities in the multifamily space?
Yeah, and a lot of our conversations do come from the operations side. So some of that is going to be a little more heavily leaned towards that. But I think it's echoing a lot of the wider market where you have the Great Resignation is hitting multifamily especially hard. So I think we're struggling through that. I think that people want to work towards their passions, and so we're seeing more need for how do you make the employment experience gratifying, and they don't want to just get a paycheck anymore. They want to do something that makes a difference. And that's we always hear that for years, but I feel like it's even more so right now. So I think those are two of the bigger things that are happening, at least on a lot of the conversations that we're seeing.
When you say that, what are some things that come to mind as it pertains to opportunity?
I think one of the sessions that we've been having within a training group is a greater emphasis on career mapping to understand what does that look like going from A to Z. So a lot in multifamily, a lot of people, they started off in a very similar spot. They started off as a leasing consultant, they moved up into management from there. So you'll see people from, the vast majority of C-suite at one point started off as a leasing consultants, right? And we're seeing a breakdown in that chain from one point to the next point. So before it was leasing consultants, assistant property manager, regional, so on. And now we're seeing a spider web of career growth where you don't necessarily have to go in that path. You don't have to go from a sales role, which is more like leasing, into more of a management role because you're forced into that because of the way the industry works. So things are definitely changed in that front.
That's really interesting. And you said you spend time, and people inside of your group spend time doing career mapping. What does that mean?
It's identifying what the skills are for an individual and creating a path for them specifically. And I mentioned sales because one of the worst way to ruin somebody's career is to go from somebody who is absolutely phenomenal at selling and then turning them into a bookkeeper.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but that's what we do all the time is we say, okay, you need to move into this next role. And what we're finding is that both on the leasing side, also on the maintenance tech side, we're seeing this progression that grows within the leasing role. So you have a leasing 1, leasing 2, leasing 3, and you grow within that. Same thing with maintenance as well, giving them those opportunities within their primary skill set.
I think it's a really cool, what you guys are doing is really cool because it sounds like you get really into the nitty gritty. It's not just a high level, hey, here's how to buy apartments. Hey, here's how to underwrite and evaluate them. It is really, this sounds much more operationally intensive than a lot of other things we see out there.
So it's really a mix of both, but the way our community works is in the same way as you'd imagine with LinkedIn, is driven by the community. Yeah. So what happens is when people want to share in a certain path, then more people end up sharing that path because people, they tend to follow a bit as far as like, I heard a great idea here and now I'm going to add my 2 cents in. Right. So one of my roles is to make sure that we're expanding our net. We have a lot of owners and investors and trying to show them, hey, you can be a thought leader in this space and it's going to add value to your world. Then suddenly we can expand that communication. We have, our site reaches over 200,000, multifamily professionals all across the board over the course of a year. So it's a matter of what people want to do. Do they want to be a thought leader and kind of expand from that way? And in that sense, we're always looking for new voices from the owner side and the investor side.
How do you, so let's talk about that for a minute, because I think this is maybe going to be the title of the show, is something along the lines of, taking someone and having them become an industry thought leader. Where does someone start that has no idea how to share their experiences and share their knowledge with other people?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that people underestimate what they know. And they assume that since they know it themselves, that everybody must already know it. And I guarantee you that's not true. Everybody has their own unique perspective, even if it's something that's widely known. The way they approach it in their own perspective, adding their own background in life and their own background in their career, is going to give it a different spin to something that people may already know, or it could be completely different. We went through this when we first started off. We have an open platform. Some people didn't like that because they wanted to say, you need to be vetted in a certain way. Now, through our editorial process, we still say we're only going to really push out the most valuable pieces of content. But our theory was that everybody has something worthwhile to share, even if it's just like once a month, you just have something that you think, okay, I need to share this. That's worth sharing, and we don't want to lock people out. I also think that when we think about thought leadership, people underestimate the value of their own career development when they are producing thought leadership pieces, because you have to go through the process of thinking through it, refining it, and really digging into your own knowledge to understand it, because you want to be as polished and as valuable to the readers or to the viewers as you can. So that process of becoming a thought leader elevates your game, because then you really have to analyze your own thoughts.
I love the idea where you said that people underestimate or undervalue what it is that we know, because it's funny when you start getting, especially into nuanced topics, multifamily ownership. Yeah, it's nuanced. And it's like, oh wait, I actually have a great wealth of information here to share. We just don't necessarily know how to bring it out or what to share at the right time. Is there a specific kind of map that you guys use, or maybe that even you have used? I mean, because again, even your platform itself was kind of what you're telling other people to do is just a reiteration of what you've already done here on building this platform. So is there a roadmap?
I think the biggest thing is in your career, everybody must identify where they're going to place focus and make sure that they make it a consistent priority. A lot of people, they will say, hey, I'm going to do this, and they do it once or twice, and then they kind of lose focus. And so I think that setting up a timeline and saying, I'm going to do this on this periodic basis and sticking to that, because when we're thinking about thought leadership, people don't want to follow somebody who's a flash in the pan. They want to follow somebody who is with them, who's growing with them, who they feel like is part of the community. So having that established presence is a huge difference. And I've seen this multiple times where people have grown their career, like grown their business, by being a constant presence and sharing their knowledge, and people start subscribing to them. And it's funny, I hear these stories from them. They're saying, I was at the airport and we're going to a conference. There's some people, in the same vein in the airport at the same time, and they get recognized and go, I love your blogs because they're amazing, and they made an impact, and they're finally seeing it firsthand about how it impacts them. And then the other thing I think is I always have an idea list. And so even if I can't write down that blog or do that video at that moment, I have a long list of things that I have in the queue, so that I never have to worry about going through that drought. Because sometimes I'll have a ton of ideas right at the same time, and other times maybe I just don't have something to say at that moment, And so always having that log will keep me going, so I always have something to put out.
I love that. I certainly love that. And yeah, that's something I try to keep myself either on a phone or on a task list or somewhere where it's like, and I failed this the other day because I had this idea. I'm like, oh man, I haven't thought about that. I need to, and I didn't write it down. Now I can't tell you what it is. It does happen. Let's talk about best practices for a minute. Tell me as it pertains to multifamily acquiring, owning, operating, selling, what do you feel like are maybe the top 2 or 3 best practices that people need to have in their toolkit right now?
I think that probably the biggest one, and it kind of comes back to the networking side of things. I think that people sometimes when they start going into investing, they kind of they read a lot, but then meeting somebody and talking with them is going to be a wealth of knowledge much greater than trying to figure things out on their own. Building your team and having your quality piece at every single spot is going to give you more knowledge than you'd ever need. So I think that the big thing is building your team and going to networking events and going networking online and kind of finding others that are going to be the similar spot that have already been through that, so you're not reinventing the wheel.
Man, that's so true. That is so true. Certainly have acquired a lot of assets just by doing exactly, what it is that you talked about right there, going and doing networking, talking to people, adding team members. It's an overlooked, I think, not skill set, but it's just something that if you don't do it, then it's going to leave a lot of opportunity there on the table that we don't certainly want to do that. So that's really cool. I love that. I love what you guys are doing. I love the way that you guys have plugged in, found a way to niche down into the multifamily space, present training and best practices opportunities for those that join your group. Just the way that you can share, and like you said, for the most part, I think you said you catch flack for having it too open. Was that right? Something
right.
Something to that effect, where it's, hey, you're too open, but I really like that. Certainly that's the way we can learn and all grow together. Brent, if our listeners want to get in touch with you or learn more about you or your group, what is the best way to do that?
So I think there's a couple different ways. You can go to multifamilyinsiders.com, which is our primary site. I think for your listeners, though, I would go to the Multifamily Insiders group on LinkedIn. So every one of our little areas has a different demographic mix. And I think that in general, our LinkedIn group has a lot more of the, owners, investors, brokers. We see a lot of conversations there. So I would check that out. We have a company and a group. So make sure to look up the group on LinkedIn called Multifamily Insiders.
Fantastic. Brent, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show today. I certainly appreciate it. We look forward to connecting again here soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.